Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining what is Hidden Secrets and Success Stories, which is the fourth of our Potential Over Polis speaker series, which focuses on social mobility and intersectionality and how those two things come together, hopefully to broaden and deepen the sort of talent that we can access in our industry to get a bit of greater diversity of thought. My name's David Aujala. By day, I'm a fund manager in the multi-asset team at Invesco, and also by day, mainly evenings, I'm the co-lead of the Diversity Project's social mobility workstream. Today, we have three fantastic speakers from sort of different stages of their careers who've had, I think, really valuable experiences that they want to pass on, some of the tips and tricks that they found help them progress well in the industry and get them to where they are. And they are, as I said, at different stages, from relatively new to particularly senior. Unfortunately, one of them couldn't actually make it today. They had a funeral to be at, but they really wanted to participate. So what we did was we jumped on a call a couple of days ago and pre-recorded it just so that we could get all of those fantastic experiences and thoughts together. And we thought we'd play that for you now and then jump on afterwards and do some Q&A if there's time left. What I'd love you to do as this is playing is to put any questions you have in the sort of chat function of this call. We'll get to some of them if we have time. And if we don't, we'll publish an open Q&A if we can on the Diversity Project website addressing all of those questions. So Caroline, when you get a chance, could you press play and we'll see our fantastic speakers. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the fourth in our speaker series, Potential Over Polish. And this particular speaker session is about the hidden secrets and success stories that some of our guests here have experienced throughout their journeys in their careers so far. Today with me, I've got Mitesh Sheth, who is the CIO of multi-asset at Newton Investment Management. I've got Kelly Mullane, who is a global deal manager in the EMEA sales team at Northern Trust. And I've got Maisie Salisbury, who works in UK institutional in the sales support area for JP Morgan Asset Management. I guess if we could start, really get into the meat of it, what I'd really like the audience to hear today is a bit about you, so a brief introduction to yourself and really your story. We're talking obviously a lot about socioeconomic diversity and social mobility, but we also know that means really different things to different people. So if you could let us know what it means to you and your experiences, that'd be fantastic. Mitesh, can we start with you?
Thanks, David. Thanks, David, and hi, everyone. So my parents were immigrants from Africa to the UK in the 70s, and their parents were immigrants from India to Africa a few decades before that. I remember my dad talking about going to school in Africa, in Kenya, and you're feeling embarrassed because his dad sold peanuts outside of the school gates, and he'd kind of usher him away or wish that he wasn't standing there or otherwise. I know that when my parents came to England, though neither had been to university, they had various jobs in Kenya, but when they came to the UK, they had to take whatever jobs they could get, and some of their educational qualifications wasn't recognised. So, they tell me about some of the jobs they did, and everything from selling cars to, my mum was a security guard, which I find really hard to imagine. Insurance sales, furniture shops, pretty much anything until they'd saved enough to buy a corner shop. And that was a real step up for them because it meant that they could be kind of masters of their own destiny. And it was around that time that I was born. I was in a council house in Bolton near Manchester, and there were 8 other members of the family, dad's brothers and sisters, who lived in the same house. It was around the age of 4 that we first went to India, and because none of us had ever been, and my dad was having, I guess, a bit of an identity crisis at the time, and we ended up spending 5 years there. So I did primary school there as the English kid in this Indian school in India, and was very much an outsider as they made fun of my accent and kind of all my Britishness. At the age of 9, I came back to England and did secondary school here, and I was made fun of here for my Indian accent. and all of the Indian habits and fashion sense that I picked up whilst I was there. So it was an obvious target for bullies at my school, and it was a relatively rough state school in Crawley. With I guess one of my real memories of school was one of my teachers asking me to just be quiet at the back of the class and not keep putting my hand up trying to answer questions. If I could just be shut up and not be seen, that was the key to success at school. A lot of my youth was surrounded with kind of friends who didn't have parents at home, as mine were working double shifts often to make ends meet. So it was a lot of alcohol, a lot of drugs, a lot of antisocial behavior, and frankly just roaming the streets of Crawley with no one at home and no one to hold us to account. Going through as I did, I did get my head down at the age of 17 and decided that I didn't want to be a victim of my circumstances. And it was that book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that was the real turning point for me, that talked about that victim mindset and taking control of the choices, the things in your control. And so I did get good grades. I managed to get into LSE. I wanted to go to Oxford. But the school had never sent anyone there and weren't able to prepare me. And I'm not sure I would have even gone to university if it wasn't free and there wasn't a generous student loan available. My parents had their own debts and wouldn't have been able to support that. So I can think it's a very different decision for people today. And coming out of university, my road to finance was just that I had my own university debts to pay off. I wanted to help my parents and my family with kind of their debts and support them. And being good at maths meant that a job in the city, was the way to do that. Even though I loved acting, I knew there was no chance of doing that. And my dad had a very clear sense of that's not going to happen whenever I tried to raise it with him. So yeah, that was really kind of my story, and I made lots of applications, and I just couldn't get in. I couldn't work out why I didn't fit the mold. And it was actually I was on a charity activity in the Lake District where a whole bunch of kind of kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were taken out with volunteers from the city and otherwise, where one of the volunteers was an actuary and who took a real interest in me and saw something and encouraged me connected me with his HR team for an internship because I didn't know anyone in the city and didn't know any route in. So that was it, a little bit about myself and my journey.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Mitesh. There's a few things that I picked up that actually, from a very selfish perspective, quite a lot of that resonates with me. My dad grew up in Kenya. Nobody had been to university and so on. But more broadly, I think the idea of, obviously we're from Bolton, which is, as we know, our industry is very focused towards London and the southeast and maybe Edinburgh if you're in Scotland. So I think there's something to learn there about how difficult it might be to come from sort of out in the region, so to speak. Also, I love the fact that you read the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People at that age as well. And it was such a game changer. So I suppose it is sort of these influences and that particular actuary on that sort of charity trip that it must feel a bit like a sliding doors moment, where if that hadn't happened, what would have happened? What would your life kind of be like? Fantastic. And I'm sure we'll pick up on some of that later as we go through some of the other things we want to cover. In the meantime, Kelly, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your story, please?
Of course. Well, I think I'm maybe balancing out the country because I'm from the West Country, down in the southwest there. So again, not a typical region that you find many people from in the city. That said, I do hear the odd accent occasionally and go, oh, where are you from? So yeah, Kelly Mullane. I grew up in a little village, a little town called Ivy Bridge, just outside of Plymouth. I went to my local juniors, infants, juniors, and comprehensive school. I was very comfortably well off. And in fact, it wasn't really until I ventured further afield that I realized that from a social economic background, there are several echelons of wealth above what you would consider, or what I considered to be incredibly wealthy. My mum, alongside her full-time job in the NHS, was the first in our family to go to university, but I followed her, and I got a sponsorship actually at that time from the RAF. I followed my father's footsteps into the armed forces. However, events occurred and I decided to transfer my sponsorship or bursary to the army. And I was the first in my family to go to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, which is the officer training academy. I gained the Queen's Commission, as it was called then. It's now a King's Commission, so that we're a dying breed, those of us that hold the Queen's Commission there. And I was obviously an officer in the British Army for nearly 8 years. I served predominantly out in the Middle East, having specialised in Arabic and Middle Eastern politics as my degree. So you can imagine I spoke that language and used it to great effect. And then came out the army really not knowing what it was I was going to do next. I knew I had a plethora of skills, but didn't even know where to live. Do I go back home? Do I head back down to the West Country? Do I look further afield? You know, what opportunities are there out there? So I put my CV on a number of websites. And was called up actually one day by a retired infantry major who called me and said, "Kelly, would you be interested in a job in the city?" And he talked very much like that. And I said, "Which city?" I had no idea what the guy was talking about. And it wasn't until he's like, maybe we need a chat. So he brought me in, got me talking, and I thought, well, could have a go at this, why not? And that's one thing I think I learned growing up, particularly from my mum and dad, was have a go. You know, just have a go. If it doesn't work, doesn't matter, but just have a go. My mum used to say to me, one door shuts, another window opens, you know. So yeah, I was very fortunate to be given someone took a chance on me. And I love the way that Mitesh said that. Someone took a chance on me. They saw some potential. A fantastic lady who's I'm still actually in my life, and I really got on well, and she could see something, and I subsequently worked with her for a few years. I then transferred and moved around the city, and it wasn't really until about 8 years later I found a home at Northern Trust, where I have continued to progress my career here. Have I lost my accent? Maybe a little bit, I don't know. Maybe that's just because I've been down in the southeast for too long, but certainly, you know, I've had a wonderful career so far, and I think it's mainly because, although I've had an atypical background, I would say, compared to others, that there was someone who could see potential over polish.
Nicely done. That's fascinating also. I think that obviously you highlighted it yourself, the idea of people being there to take a chance. Now, that happened to me as well also, by the way, especially when I joined here at Invesco. There was a person who at the time was the global head of global equity product. And just allowed me to do things beyond my remit to prove that I could do them, right? And you get the opportunity that way, and I think that's really important. As much as I love it, it also worries me the fact that we all feel quite lucky, and they are sliding doors type moments that may not have happened, and it feels like it's less of a systemic thing that's there to help us, more it's there for those who are willing to take the chance, like you said, but also have the luck on top. I think Gary Player, the golfer, says, the harder I practice, the luckier I get, I think is what he used to say. But the fact that there's no guarantee is quite frightening as well sometimes, isn't it? Maisie.
Hello, everyone. My name's Maisie, and I joined JP Morgan in 2018. I joined as a school leaver on the Investment 2020 programme, which I'm sure a lot of people listening into this call would have come across. This meant that I decided not to go to university, very last minute in my case, but yeah, I joined straight from school. For me, mobility is about neurodiversity. I was diagnosed with dyslexia in secondary school, which was quite a late diagnosis. I think I was about 15 when I was diagnosed, but it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It made everything make sense, and just made life a whole lot easier. Like Mitesh and Kelly, I also went to a state school, although unlike Mitesh, I wasn't told to stop talking for answering too many questions. I was just the chatterbox at the back of the class. I'm going to talk about dyslexia today, but quick disclaimer before I start, dyslexia is totally different for everyone. I'm quite severely dyslexic. Some people will be mild, and then even within that, dyslexia presents itself to everyone with different traits. In terms of not going to university, it was always mapped out for me that I would go to university. I went to a grammar school. It was a state school, but it was a grammar school. So it's always mapped out that you would go to Oxbridge. So it was quite the U-turn when I decided towards the end of sixth form that I, in fact, was going to cancel all my applications. So yeah, although I'm focusing on dyslexia today, I'm also happy to talk about the not going to university side of things.
That's great. Thank you so much, Maisie. And I think that is actually really important, that, well, everything you've said there is important, but in terms of socioeconomic diversity, when we think about the idea of going to university, the traditional route into our industry, you know, Mitesh mentioned that you probably wouldn't be able to afford it if it wasn't for some of the support that was available at the time. Certainly, I think when I went, it was means tested and I didn't have to pay anything given my background, but I think the most you did have to pay was £1,000 or something a year, so it was a bit more accessible. Now it's a much bigger decision, I think, for many, many people, taking on tens of thousands of debt to get into an industry that you probably feels quite hard to get into when you're that age now. So I think it is really important and really good to have your perspective on coming in what used to be called a non-traditional way, but I hope it becomes more of a traditional way actually over the next few years. And by the way, I also went to a state grammar school, and I think that was one of the first times where Kelly alluded to this herself when she got to university, but when I got to a grammar school, I really realised how different we were from other people. So I grew up on a council estate in the southeast, so a place called Langley. It's only about 15-20 miles from London, but felt very far away from the city of London, of course. And I remember going home sometimes, in the sort of area that I lived in was quite rough. And I remember going home thinking, right, I've got some homework to do tomorrow, and I couldn't get to my own flat because there was a big police incident going on, and you couldn't get back there for 5 hours, and very hard to explain that to somebody the next day as to why you haven't done your homework. You might as well have said that the dog had eaten it. So yeah, thank you for that. What I thought might be interesting is if we maybe take you and maybe Kelly first, talk about some of the challenges that you've had through your career, but also some of the opportunities. So to keep it positive as well, I know, having spoken to all of you before, that there have definitely been challenges as you've progressed through your career, but there have also been opportunities there as well. So I'd love to hear a bit more about those.
I think happy to take. One thing we were talking about before was imposter syndrome, and I think this is something that I have struggled with pretty much since I left the university. I think throughout my time at Sandhurst, do I fit in with this group of very intelligent, brilliant women? Could I be an army officer? Then throughout my career as an army officer, you had the whole, I was a female, so not quite fit in with the whole mold of an army officer. Was I seen the same? Probably not. Remember, this is 15-20 years ago, so diversity, equity, inclusion wasn't something that the army really took into account in those days. And then subsequently, my financial career, if you like, certainly, I spent 15 years or 8 years in the British Army, becoming the Kelly that I am, or was, I suppose, when I left. Was offered a job in a city and an industry that I knew nothing about, and I had to learn pretty much from the bottom upwards what I was doing, and felt like pretty much, and continue to feel sometimes like a complete imposter. What on earth are they letting this girl, who's grew up in Ivy Bridge in Devon with, not bad grades, let's be honest, but, certainly not, Oxbridge or anything like that, looking at, multi-million-pound deals that I'm managing across the globe. Really? You're going to let me be responsible for that? I felt the same, to be fair, when they gave me my daughter after giving birth, gave me this small, tiny child and said, right, you can now go home. And I'm thinking, they're just going to you're going to let me take this small, precious thing home with me? Are you mad? I don't know what I'm doing. So I think all of us really feel at times a little bit of imposter syndrome. And I get through that by having a fantastic support network around me of brilliant people, that I can kind of say, oh, I'm not sure about, you've got this, you know, that those cheerleaders in life that are around you, and they can be people you work with. I think they're my best friends in the whole world. It's your family, you know, you've got these cheerleaders around. They say, hey, you've got this. I've seen you do, you know, much more complicated or much more, you know, difficult things than this, you know. And, you know, I always laugh with some of my colleagues today, and, you know, I say, yeah, it wasn't bad. It's not quite Basra, but it's okay, you know, when we compare, but still.
I guess it's nice to have that frame of reference when you're having a really bad Monday.
Yeah, I think you've got a unique sense of perspective, I think, is what it's often known as. Yeah.
In terms of that support network, and I think you know, it's important, so important for all of us, and friends and family, if we're lucky enough to have you know, a network like that, is fantastic. But outside of that, was that something that just happened to be around you, or is it something you actively sought out, or a mixture of the two? Did you try and build this sort of network of people to help and support you?
I'd say it's a bit of both. I'd say you've naturally got those people that are your cheerleaders, your team, your people. But certainly it's also good to build on your network as well. And that's something I actively did all the way through my career. I always felt that if I didn't know the answer, the key was that I knew someone who did. So I was always keen to ensure that I had a great big network of people in the institution or the corporations that I was working in. And it's something I continue to this day. I expend an awful amount of emotional capital in building that team around me, that team of experts, because, you know, you're only as smart as the smartest person in the room, and usually that's definitely someone else in my case. So I tend to, try and build that group of people around me too.
I think they say if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. So I think you're doing it the right way, Kelly. So don't feel bad about that at all. That's the right way to do it. So you mentioned earlier, just because I've got a kind of list of things that we think about, like imposter syndrome, gravitas, so on, building confidence, having a growth mindset, all the things they tell us that we should be trying to do or avoid. And you mentioned accents, and you weren't sure whether or not you had it. So is it fair to say that the accent kind of bias thing hasn't really been a factor for you? Because I know some people from certain regions feel like they've lost a bit of that, or maybe on purpose try to tone it down to fit in, or they've sort of just naturally lost it and they go home and they feel like they're code switching because everyone back where they're from kind of says, oh, there's the posh one from London back type thing. Did you ever experience any of that?
Not a huge amount. I think it's mainly because the West Country accent is relatively mild, maybe. No, not a huge amount of that. And I think I've just lost it over time, working with a variety of different accents, people, you know, and it's just been one of those things. But it's certainly not something I actively hide. And I think now maybe that comes with age, maybe it comes with gravitas, maybe it comes with experience, but it's not something I feel I need to hide anymore.
That's a great point, actually. I think as you do progress within your career, maybe you're less inclined or feel like you know, less like you have to do some of those things as well. Mitesh, can I ask you about some of the challenges and opportunities? Obviously, you've had quite the career from where you started and various things that you've done along the way. So it'd be great to hear about some of your thoughts.
Thanks, David. And yeah, just to build on what Kelly was saying about imposter. So I've had imposter syndrome multiple times through my career, but I'm now kind of 44 years old. I started a job as CIO here at Newton about 11 months ago. And I couldn't believe that for the first 4 or 5 months, I was hijacked by this crippling fear of why did they hire me? And am I a token hire ticking a box? Do they really value me for my skills? Do they need me for my skills? Is this the right decision? I'm surrounded by all these smart people navigating these crazy financial markets. Maybe they made a mistake, and it just consumed me. And I think the impact of that is, I just don't think the firm saw what I could do or got the best out of me for those few months. And a tip I wanted to share that one of my coaches gave to me to help me overcome it was to say, hire yourself for the job. And he asked me to list down what are all the things you believe that Newton needs and map against that what you bring to the role. And hire yourself for it, underwrite yourself for it. And he kind of said, in any room when you're feeling like that, ask what that room needs and underwrite what it is that you bring. And it doesn't have to be what everyone else brings to that business, to that firm, or to that room. And it was just such a quick hack, actually, that I hope next time round I don't get consumed for so many months as a result. But it has been with me throughout my career. Just going back a few steps, I think early in my career when I started, and I can imagine this being for many people who have grown up with some level of poverty or debt that they're trying to pay off, or even a wider responsibility they feel. I was really driven. Every year I'd go to my manager and say, what do I need to do to be paid more? What do I need to do to get promoted? And he'd be like, what's wrong with you? Could you just get on with the job? And so I would constantly, every year in my appraisal, I'd be like, well, Mitesh is a little too ambitious, a little too driven, a little too kind of money orientated, or even self orientated. And I was, for me, it was just I had to pay off debts, and I had to provide for my family, and I wanted to support my wider family. And I didn't really see the kind of how the image and that left people looking at me with. And what was really funny was that once I'd done that, I had almost zero interest in the next pay rise or promotion or otherwise. And it was then I could start enjoying work for the sake of enjoying work, rather than it being very much a means to an end. So that was interesting. I wonder how that affects other people, but it definitely, I was really grateful people took me to the side and said, you need to tone this down. You need to see how this comes across, which I clearly didn't. The other thing was I rarely opened up about what I did on my evenings or weekends, because it was embarrassed to, because it sounded so dreary compared to what everybody else around me did, whether it was, big concerts or ski trips or, whatever else that they were doing. And I wasn't. I was usually volunteering or working with our local charity, or, helping the family out in some way, or doing something, at home. And so it made it, I rarely kind of opened up about it, and didn't really think about it at the time, but it was probably not until I became CEO in 2016 when again a coach said to me, you've got to open up more. People see you as this kind of closed figure, and they're going to struggle to trust you, to know how you'll operate when they're not in the room without you showing more of yourself. You've got to be more vulnerable, which was crazy. I'd kind of learnt throughout all of my career kind of how to almost protect myself from these feelings of inadequacy. So that was something I had to deliberately work on. And I talk a lot about how there are these kind of almost hidden barriers to leadership. If you are struggling with a lack of confidence, or you feel you don't belong, or you've kept yourself closed for not feeling like you fit in. A couple of other ones. I mean, I was told lots of times in feedback that you're a rough diamond, which was code for we need to smooth out the edges, and then we might see something that kind of fits in. And at the time, I was grateful for the feedback and the perspective. Yeah, clearly someone was giving me some feedback on my blind spots and how I came across, whether I was cutting people up or whether I was, whatever it was. But later in my career, I've kind of looked back and felt a bit sad that I lost some of myself through that polishing, and by fitting in. And what was really ironic is, again, as I became CEO, people were like, well, but what do you stand for, and what do you really care about, and what are the things that really drive you? And I was like, well, that's funny. I've spent my entire career trying to not think about what I care about and what I want to fit into what everyone else expects of me, and now all of a sudden I need to invest in my own kind of views and values and opinions. So yeah, again, I think a lot of people, maybe in a similar circumstance, end up being a bit of a chameleon, and actually don't realize that that's a barrier to leadership, and one that doesn't get talked about a lot. Okay, the final one I wanted to touch on was when I left my CEO role in mid 2021. I felt this huge sense of shame, and that I was letting my entire community down, having been the first one, of anyone I knew who had taken on a role like that. And the amount of pride not only my parents but so many people in the wider community felt with me having, there's one of us, if he can do it, I can do it. And I decided I didn't want to do it anymore. I wanted to take on a different role and a different challenge, and I had to really battle with the shame that came with that and that burden of letting others down. And I think often people don't realize, when you're one of a few of whatever that is, it doesn't have to be socioeconomic, you're carrying others' hopes and aspirations with you, especially if you're early in that. It's not all negative. I mean, I think as a result of my background, I think I was a bit more creative. I think I was a bit more risk-taking. I was a bit more of a problem solver. I think I dealt with stress and resilience better than many around me. So there were lots and lots of positives that make me want to hire others who've had and faced difficulties. And just to Maisie, I'm so pleased to hear you joined through Investment 2020. That was actually Andrew Formica and I back at Henderson, more than a decade ago. Andrew came to us with this idea of, rather than hiring lots of graduates, what if we hired people straight out of school? And Investment 2020 began as a kind of an internal program at Henderson and then spun out into its own charity. So delighted that you joined through that, and I think it's fantastic, and keen to hear more from you.
Wonderful, thanks, Mitesh, and an amazing segue as well. I must say that here at my firm as well, we adopt that exact program. Quite a few people every year come through, and I think it's fantastic that they get that experience. And actually, not just a couple of weeks; it is a proper immersive type program that I think adds value. And we'll come back in a moment in the next question to the idea of sort of introspection, mentors, self-learning, and so on, because you've mentioned quite a few of that, and Kelly as well. You kind of spoke about the fact that you were at Sandhurst, and I suspect there's some stuff in there that you probably learned that's helped you throughout your career. Maisie, before we do that, I think it would be really great to hear some of the challenges and also the opportunities that you've faced in your, obviously, relative to us oldies, shorter, hopefully illustrious career.
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, my diagnosis was the best thing to happen to me, and I've always seen dyslexia as a gift. My mum specialises in teaching children with dyslexia and owns a business surrounding this. So it was always drilled into me that there is nothing wrong with you. You just learn a different way, and that's okay. I was also lucky enough to have the most amazing one-to-one support teacher in my school. And I think my story would have been very, very, very different if I didn't have her supporting me. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, dyslexia actually has nothing to do with intelligence. So I achieved a star in every exam I took, and I honestly think that dyslexia helped me to achieve this. Because I had that support network around me, I was able to really utilise the positive traits that dyslexia can bring. So the over-organisation, the creativity, the thinking outside the box, problem solving, all these things I was able to use to my advantage. The 25% extra time in the laptop did also help as well. But it's not all sunshine and roses. I did have to work hard. I had to revise a lot harder and a lot longer than most of my peers to get these grades. Even now, often when I read something, I can spend however long reading it, and I cannot tell you what I've just read. I will have to read it time and time again, and just take in a small bit of information each time I read it. And every day is different. Some days you wouldn't know I'm dyslexic, absolutely no effect at all. Other days I come away feeling absolutely exhausted because even the simplest task, reading, writing emails, takes a lot of effort, and words move around as I'm trying to read them. And that's quite exhausting when that happens. Another challenge I face in a work context is recalling certain details off the top of my head. So if there's project A, B, C, and each one's got a different client, project, product, date, things like that. If someone randomly comes up to me and asks, what's the date on project B, I might struggle to recall that. But one of my coping strategies is being over-organised. So I'll have it all written down, it will all be tracked, and I will be on top of it all and know all the details, but just off the top of my head on the spot, I might struggle to recall it. And again, I'll touch on later, as you mentioned, why it's therefore so important to have the right people around you. Also at work, I'm awful at names, faces, remembering what teams people are in. So that can sometimes lead to awkward situations. But I think, like I said, I've got such a strong support network, and I realise how valuable of an asset I can be, because diversity of thought is so important. There's a good anecdote in Matthew Syed's book, Rebel Ideas, and I'm paraphrasing and completely butchering the story, but they showed a fish tank to two groups of people. The first group, when asked to recall it, could describe every single detail of the fish, but nothing of the environment. The second group could describe the environment, but absolutely nothing about the fish. So both are correct, just clearly have got big gaps. So I see how there will be people at work who are neurotypical, and yet they're not getting anything wrong, they're great at their job, but I can come in and maybe fill that gap by thinking in a way that they don't see it and they're not thinking. Neither of us are wrong, we're both right, but you can just complement each other.
That's fantastic, and I think we'll stick with you to talk about that mentoring type thing, given that you've mentioned it. But before we do, I'm really glad that you've mentioned all the things you have, but in particular, Rebel Ideas, the Matthew Syed book. That was the first session we did in this whole speaker series, and it was absolutely fantastic. And some of the things, including sort of anecdotes like that, just make you reassess what diversity of thought really is and how valuable it can be as well. Particularly given what we do in this industry, right? That's basically our kind of superpower, right? If we harness it properly. The other one was when you were talking about sort of your I think you call it a coping strategy or a coping mechanism, and just the idea of having those. And Mitesh, you did some work in advance, really, didn't you, in terms of coaching, reading that book quite young as well, and so obviously, but also when you're in the workplace, having some of these things in place. And the other one I thought was the sort of having the people around you. So if you could tell us a bit more about that from your perspective, because I think I don't know, it could be that for less visible diversity traits, it's harder to get those people around you, or for them to even know they need to be around you, right? Whereas for more visible things, arguably, it could be a little bit easier.
Yeah, so the one person who really stands out to me is my one-to-one support teacher, who I mentioned. Even though I left that school in 2018, still to this day in my head, when I'm in a situation I don't know what to do, I think, what does Miss Ford do? She was my dyslexia support, my shoulder to cry on. Often she was the one getting me out of trouble. So that really sticks with me. And although it was years and years ago, I use that every day. But I think it's not just about having a specialist, and in work, the most important thing is just being human and being compassionate. I mentioned earlier that I might struggle to recall details if put on the spot. So for me, it's really important that I'm around people who I'm comfortable enough just to say, you know what, I can't remember it right now, but I've got it written down, I'm on top of it. And I'm comfortable enough to say, I don't know, but give me some extra time. And also have people who trust me to know that I'm on it and I can do the work. It will just be a different way. So I don't think it's about having formal mentors, although they're great. I'm not saying don't do that. But for me, it's just about having people who will fight your back. An example is my interview for my current role was shocking, like terrible. One of the interviewers says it was the worst interview they've ever done, and they've been at the company for 30 years. So that says something.
Oh, wow.
But that same interviewer knew me. I've always been very open about my dyslexia. So she knew me, knew my dyslexia, and fought my corner and said, I know Maisie. And that person that was on the screen just then is not what she's actually like. I think it's so important. And you said, my last point, you said it can be difficult to have find these people when you've got a non-visible condition. So I think it's just so important to be open and let people know how they can help. I know what it's like not to be open. Before I was diagnosed, you know, if it came to reading out loud in class, I'd get in an argument with the teacher because they said I was just being lazy or stupid for not wanting to read, or I'd get myself in trouble so I could get kicked out of the classroom before it came to me. Or I would just spend the whole time rereading my little section, so I'm not listening to what anyone else is, that I'm not listening to the rest of the lesson. So although that's school, I think you can see how it would affect your work if it was the same principle carried through. So you've just got to be open about it and tell people how they can help you, because people do want to help you, but they're not mind readers.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. And that I mean, amazing interview feedback in an amazing way, of course. I mean, I think if you're going to get negative feedback, you might as well get that kind of feedback. You might as well win something. But fantastic that person knew you well enough to basically see the potential and understand what you're really like. And I think what worries me actually a little bit, and not just our industry but all industries, is that we sometimes, especially at the entry level, we don't get the opportunity to know and understand that person, and we're judging them on things like how they do on a Zoom call for 30 minutes, or coming into the office in an unknown environment when they're already kind of worried about it. We're probably not getting the best assessment of what their potential is, which I guess is what this whole series is about, right? It's why it's called Potential Over Polish. And to Mitesh's point, it was going to be called Diamonds in the Rough or Rough Diamonds or something like that. But we were sort of umming and ahhing about what to call it. But I think, the principle's true whichever way you think about it. So thank you very much for that. Kelly, I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming based on what you've said and your background in the military that you've had some people to look up to and learn from, and potentially do the same yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, I've served under some fantastic officers and soldiers in my time. Worked with some soldiers in my time, amazing, and some not so great, let's be honest. But I still harp on about my first ever female platoon commander at Sandhurst. She's actually a friend of mine on Facebook now. It's like, and then she comments, and I'm still overwhelmed by the fact that this wonderful woman who I've looked up to for many, many years is commenting and going, and still a cheerleader, which is wonderful. So that's all good fun. I think I learned a lot from them. The army gives you a sense of confidence in yourself anyway. Certainly as an officer, you need to lead men. So I would say it's probably arguably the best leadership course anyone can ever go on. And I'm sure there are people in the city who will dispute that, but personally, I believe it to be the case. So certainly, I know how to lead a team, and I hope most of the people I work with would agree with that statement. But what I would say is I spent many, many hours worrying about how I would come across. And, was I a good enough officer? Was I a good enough leader of my men, women? Am I still a good enough, leader to be a senior vice president at a global organization? And one of the things I've realized, and I think this comes with confidence and experience, I would say, is that gravitas and, the whole, I suppose, ideal of leadership is massively overrated, and the best leaders I have worked for, the best people I have worked for, have always been authentically themselves. And I would say that 100%, the people I look up to, the people I've looked up to throughout all of my career have always been themselves. They've never tried to be something different, and they've never come across as something different than just themselves. So we mentioned how, you'd name and load points around what you would see as an exceptional leader, and gravitas would always come up as being one of those things. I never come across with gravitas, I would argue, and I don't think that I need to, because I lead in other ways. So, and I would hope that people look at me and think, well, that's authentically Kelly. That's just her. She's buzzy, she's whizzy, she's enthusiastic. We can follow her, and when she needs to be, she can be serious and frankly a little bit scary too, but that's okay. My kids and my husband would probably agree with that, but that's okay too, because you have to be authentically yourself. So that's my biggest piece of advice to younger Kelly, is don't worry about being someone else, just be you.
That's fantastic. And I think, to be honest, I think that is gravitas, really, isn't it? It's just not forced gravitas. It's kind of being yourself. People wouldn't follow you unless you were authentic, and they, well, certainly not over the long term anyway. So no, that is fantastic to hear. Mitesh.
Hey, yeah, still learning how to be myself, if I'm honest, but inspired by what you both said. And yeah, around the I loved what Maisie said about, you've got to invite people to help. You can't expect them to read your mind. I'd always been taught to be strong, and so I really struggled to ask for help. And I think I'm still learning to, but it is the biggest transformation when you can. And I think it's accepting yourself and your differences enough, and valuing yourself enough to be able to do it. And so I think I can, but it is a big barrier for those who don't have that self-value, and or have it eroded every day by not feeling like they belong. In terms of inspirations and mentors and sponsors and so on, I don't think I've ever had a formal mentor or sponsor, but I've definitely had people who've believed in me, who've championed me, who've seen something in me that I didn't see, and who've promoted me when I've not been in the room. There's this quote that an old colleague had told me about, from Yuri Bronfenbrenner, called "Every child needs at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about him or her." And I love it. I've always loved that. But I don't think it's just true for children. I think everyone, as you're going through your career, and particularly if you're different in whatever way it might be, just having somebody in the room who's crazy about you, who can see that you've got potential, and who'll champion you, whether they come in the form of a manager, mentor, coach, leader, sponsor, whatever it is. I think that's the key. And I've been really grateful. And I've almost, through my career, more than choose jobs, I've chosen to work for those people, believing that they'll get more out of me than I will left to my own devices. And so that's always been my choice when I've changed jobs. But I guess to the point Kelly finished with, my advice to my younger self, I think about this a few times, especially when I'm talking to younger people, and it tends to be, number one, have audacity to ask, because if you don't ask, you don't get. Number two, I wish I was okay being different. It's taking me a long time to embrace that and to recognize not only is it okay, it's actually valuable. It's really valuable not being the same and thinking the same and seeing things in the same way as everyone else. And I think the final one would be just to look after yourself and your mental health. And I think learning to accept myself and love myself with my quirks and differences has taken time, and seeing the boundaries and saying no rather than always exhausting myself to please others, seeing that as a sign of strength has taken time, and I wish I knew that earlier.
Fascinating. Yeah, I was thinking about this myself in terms of mentors, and I've never really had a formal mentor, but I'm not sure I found anyone who's particularly crazy about me, but I've definitely found people who are willing to kind of, like you said, be a voice or an advocate when I'm not in the room, and also sometimes to me to say, look, you can definitely do that. Trust me, you can do it. Which really helps, of course, right? Because you get the validation from the thing you're trying to fit into for the whole time. And as you said, of course, you wish your mindset hadn't been that way the whole time, and you could feel free to be yourself and see the value in that. I mean, I suppose it's quite difficult, isn't it, when you're very new to an industry? You just want to be like everyone else at that point, and fit in and feel the sort of sense of belonging. So I think that's really important. And I think hopefully it's becoming more obvious to people now, both people already in these organizations, that they need to make it an environment where people feel that they can be themselves and really demonstrate why they think that's valuable. So that's great advice from all of you. Maisie, do you have anything to add? I mean, you're a different part of your career, so I'm very interested in what you might have to say.
Yeah, I'd have a couple of quick pieces that I would tell my younger self. The first, be open. The more you talk about it, the more people are able and willing to help. And it also then in turn might help someone else talk about something that they wouldn't have the confidence to talk about. Secondly, I would say have a laugh about it. the amount of times I slip up on words, get things mixed up. If someone's watching me type, I guarantee you I will spell every single word wrong. Just have a laugh about it. And just know that you're not the problem. It's nothing to do with intelligence, just people learn in different ways. And that's okay. You need different people. Just relax, don't get stressed about it, is what I tell my younger self. It will all work out.
That's fantastic. And actually, I'd echo that. If I was going to tell myself one thing, actually, thinking about it, I'd try my best to worry less and enjoy the journey a bit more. A bit like Mitesh said, he was desperate to pay off these sort of debts, and you kind of feel just that's all you're doing, and I'm not going to enjoy myself until I've done that, and then I can enjoy. But you always find something else to not enjoy yourself about until you get to that stage, right? So I feel like we all need to just, well, certainly me, just make sure you enjoy it, because we'll blink and the whole ride will be over, and we'll regret not having made the most of it. Because one thing I do want to say to everyone listening, and I say it all the time when I'm talking about these sorts of things, I think this industry is absolutely fabulous. It does amazing things. We're all incredibly privileged to work in it, and I think of it as a sort of natural home for people with an inquiring mind. And I think we all know we're all very different on this call, and there's people in our industry and who want to be in it that are very, very different too. And so what we're really trying to do with this call is make it more accessible to those people, because ultimately we don't have any whizzy technology that other people don't have. It's all the sort of how good are our people and how diverse are their thoughts, and that sort of delivers what outcomes we can deliver for our clients. And all right, we're not heart surgeons here, but we are also trying to do some good things for society too. So that's what I would say. Look, thank you very much for your time. I think it's been absolutely fantastic. I hope people that have been watching have taken some valuable tips and actually just experiences to draw on away. And from now we'll move into the Q&A session. Thank you very much. Right, thank you everyone for watching that and staying on the line. I hope you found it interesting and useful. I'm joined at the moment by Maisie, should any of you have any questions. Unfortunately, we've only got sort of about 5 minutes for questions, because quite frankly, we were enjoying that discussion and recording too much. We didn't realize that we'd taken up nearly 50 minutes doing it. But any questions that we can't answer in the next few minutes, please put them in the chat or email caroline@diversityproject.com. Which will be in, Caroline will put that in the chat in a second, and we'll respond to it either directly or via a blog that we'll publish. And feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message if there's any questions you'd rather do that way as well. I saw one question earlier from Oliver about the idea of coaches, and I think Mitesh, who unfortunately is the one who can't make it today, is probably best placed to answer it. But I'll give you my view in the meantime while you're waiting. Look, I think any form of learning is fantastic. If you can find somebody independent, even better. Should it be to develop skills that others from more prosperous backgrounds may naturally have? I don't think that should be the primary reason, really. I think it should just be a sounding board as someone who can independently look at some of the strengths that you may have that you might not recognize in yourself. I think as an industry, it's our responsibility to hire for potential and not expect people at a really early age to have a lot of those skills that other folks do. So that's what I would say to that, and I'm sure Mitesh, given his experience using coaches, will have a much better and more detailed answer for you. So we'll get that to you, Oliver.
I would just sorry, can I just add to that as well? I think it's not necessarily about coaching, but it's more about skill sharing. So in any relationship, no matter if it's the most senior person and the most junior person in the firm, or someone from the most underprivileged versus privileged background, you're going to be able to take something from each other. And obviously Mitesh and I, well, we've all said benefits that we've had as a result of our background. So I think, yes, you can learn from the person who's probably the mentor, but also the mentoree can often like reverse mentor and share some skills back.
That's a great point, actually. And particularly when you think about people who make decisions on hiring as well, they tend to be more senior people, and the more exposure they have to other people, that they it broadens their horizons in terms of what talent looks like. There's one here, I think, about dyslexia. So are there any specific things firms can do to support dyslexic individuals? For example, tools we should get, IT to purchase, etc. Maisie?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a variety of things, but again, it will vary per person. So You can have coloured overlays that's offered to us when we join. So I find it easier reading on a blue background, and you can have a bit of software that actually changes your computer to that. We also have a font that is dyslexia friendly. Just certain letters are formed in different ways. So I'm sure there's probably, I think a lot of firms probably already have a lot in place, but it's maybe just not advertised. So it's definitely something to ask about.
Great, thank you for that. And how to have, I'm just reading these as we go. How should you have your colleagues accept your differences when you're the only one different within your team? So that might be a different background or religious beliefs. For me, that comes back to sort of leadership and culture, right? And having the right attitude. I'm not sure there's a kind of silver bullet there that's going to sort of suddenly just make that acceptable, or make people do that. I think it comes back to culture. It's arguably worrying if there is only one person that's different. I think it's worth, in my view, thinking about, well, James, Whiteman, who's my co-lead on this, he actually wrote something about this, and this is what this has made me think of. He basically said that for every sort of characteristic you may have, whether it's gender, whether it's being neurodiverse or neurotypical, whether it's your sexuality, where you're from, what your parents, you all put a different color button on for all of those different things, and you soon start to realize that we're all made up of all these different characteristics, not just one thing that people may fixate on or may be quite visible. So I would say that you're probably not the only one who's different. It might be a visibly different or something obvious that feels very different. But I suspect if everyone wore those pin badges or those buttons, there's probably a bit more diversity there. And then the second question, the second point I'd like to make, which I kind of started with, was the idea of culture. And I think, if teams are led the right way and the culture's set correctly, then it should be a given, quite frankly, that's the case. But we will get back to you with a more comprehensive answer on that as well.
I think that kind of ties into the questions. I saw someone ask one about putting tags on things. And I think in an ideal world, you wouldn't need to put tags on things, and you wouldn't need to let people know about certain differences in backgrounds, and everyone would just be treated equally. But I think you look at the nature of the people that are going to be on this call, they're clearly people who care about diversity and know that it's an important thing. Unfortunately, there still will be people that don't agree with it, and are perhaps a bit more old school, if that's the right word, and they're the people that we need to fight, help put tags on things so you can kind of identify who you need to fight for. In an ideal world, everyone would have the views of everyone on this call and be treated equally and care about people, and you wouldn't need to put tags on things. But I think in order to identify the people that need a little extra help, perhaps you do need to put tags on things at the moment.
I think that's bang on, because if you think back to what Mitesh said about his imposter syndrome, he didn't like the idea, of course, that he was wondering, did I get this for a particular reason? Nobody wants to be wearing a tag and get a job or an opportunity for that particular reason. But the socioeconomic diversity, for example, which is the kind of key strand that runs throughout this series, without focusing explicitly on it and making it a tag, for now at least, we would never have figured out the true scale of the problem, and it's huge in this industry. So I agree with everything that you said. Just scrolling through here, I think that may be all we have for live questions, and that takes us to time, actually. So that's perfect. If you do think of any more, as I said, please email them to Caroline or let me know on LinkedIn. And I really hope you enjoyed it, and we'd love to hear your feedback too. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day. Thanks, Maisie.
Thank you.